Hi, today for our question and answer from the Research Like a Pro study group, we have a question about finding sufficient evidence for proving the identity of an ancestor. Here's the full question. When I am documenting ancestors, what is considered sufficient evidence for proving they are the correct person? If I have an unproven ancestor in my tree who fought in the American Revolution, and that person has been documented by others, is there a way to utilize their research to capture documentation? At this time, I am not planning to submit an application to the DAR or similar organizations, but would like to know what their standards of proof would be. Since I am new to this, I would like to see if I can follow the more stringent standards if possible, and documents are readily available. Can you direct me to a resource for DAR standards? Is this a realistic goal? So this was submitted by one of our study group members, and I think, yes, it is a realistic goal. And I think it's a really good idea to try to think about what standards are you trying to reach when you're doing your research and documenting your ancestors? And I like that you mentioned DAR. That's a great organization, and they do have high standards. And so today I thought I would share a couple of things from DAR and then also from the Genealogy Standards Manual that was put out by BCG, the Board for Certification of Genealogists. And before I do that, I'll just mention that we should always build upon others' research. If we find that somebody has done research on our line, it's absolutely wonderfully helpful to look at what they have and to use that as a jumping off point. But we always want to verify what they've done so that we're confident that it's accurate. So we can see what they found and look at their sources and analyze them. So let's talk about this question now, the standards that are available. So first of all, the Daughters of the American Revolution has a document called Genealogy Guidelines, and they have this in three parts. The second part is kind of more of what your question was about. So they have this part two, completing the application and proving lineage. So this is an online document. You can find at this URL here. And within that document on page 13, it talks about how they want you to use the best possible documentation. So to be admitted to their lineage society, you need to be a direct descendant of somebody who was part of the Revolutionary War. And to prove that, you need to show parent-child links and identity of each ancestor through birth, marriage, and death documentation. And they recommend that the way you do that is by using vital records, especially for the most recent generations. So for the first three generations, they want you to have exact dates and places of birth and death. And that just means for yourself, the applicant, your parents, and your grandparents. Then when you get back to further generations, they want you to use the best possible documentation that is available. And in that document I referenced, this genealogy guidelines part two, it goes through many pages of how to get the best possible evidence. And they have a lot of suggestions for different record types, such as instead of using an author to find a grave memorial, only using the information that's on the actual headstone or tombstone, which would be an original source. And then also considering the fact that some headstones are created today for people who lived 200 years ago. So those ones would not be an original source, but they would be, well, they were created too long after the event to be useful for good evidence. So some of the other guidelines in their document are that you need to have sufficient documentation of birth, marriage, and death, but nothing more. They don't have a lot of space in their application for a lot of citations to a lot of documents, and they don't want copies of all of those documents. So they just want you to choose the record with the most complete information, like a death certificate that might say the death date, the parents' names, and the birth date and place. And so if there's no overlap between the documents that you submit, then just submit the least amount possible. And they also want you to submit documentation for the links between generations. So how do you know this is the parent of that person? They want you to use brief citations in their style that are very short. And If no directive evidence is available for something you're trying to prove in your lineage application, they say you can provide an analysis, which is like a proof argument that you might write, a 2-page form they have that you can fill out, or you can write your own. And you just share the indirect evidence and negative searches you've done to show that you've done enough research and that you've found some clues, some indirect evidence that points to your answer. You are allowed to use autosomal DNA evidence, but only for the first 3 generations in the application. So for yourself, to your parents, or to your grandparents. And Y-DNA evidence is allowed. So the DAR guidelines are very specific about how they want you to submit your application, and they do have some limitations on how you can use certain evidence and how long things can be and how many documents you can include. There's another organization that provides standards for the genealogy community, and this is from the Board for Certification of Genealogists. And in their manual called Genealogy Standards, they talk about the genealogical proof standard, which I've put here. And I've just copied and pasted the genealogical proof standard from their website, Ethics and Standards. And so that you can read that on their website, you can click this URL, but it just talks about how in order to prove a conclusion or reach a sound conclusion, we need to meet all 5 components of the GPS. So whether your conclusion is about the identity of an ancestor or their relationship to a parent, these things need to be done to feel like you have proven that conclusion. The first is reasonably exhaustive research. And this is where you check all the sources that a regular genealogist who's proficient in that time and place would check. And so you don't just get one death certificate that answers most of the questions and call it good. You would check all of the different records that might be available. And this is so that you can find out if there was an error on the one source you're looking at and correlate that information with other information. Then you need to make complete and accurate source citations that help the reader relocate the source you're using. Third is thorough analysis and correlation, where you compare the evidence to the other evidence and see how it shakes out. And then if you find conflicts after doing that, you need to resolve the conflicting evidence and say why you've chosen your conclusion and why the other evidence is incorrect or invalid. Lastly, you need to spell all of this out in a written conclusion based on the strongest evidence. So if you haven't written a conclusion that has complete source citations, that shows reasonably exhaustive research, analysis, and resolution of conflicting evidence, then you probably haven't proven your conclusion yet. The GPS overarches all of the documentation, research, and writing standards described in genealogy standards and is applied across the board in all genealogical research to measure the credibility of conclusions about ancestral identities, relationships, and life events. So to prove an ancestor, you're trying to measure the credibility of your conclusions, right? So I feel like this genealogical proof standard is what you need to review, and it will be a little more comprehensive than what the DAR requires for their lineage applications. And so let's look a little more at genealogy standards. This is the 2nd edition pictured here. And the first few pages talk about the genealogical proof standard in more detail. Then the subsequent pages include standards 1 through 90. And those standards are broken down into different sections. They have standards for documenting, which is all about source citations, standards for researching, which is the bulk of the book, standards 9 through 57. This includes standards for note taking, for DNA evidence, and for all kinds of aspects of research. Then standards 58 through 80 are about writing. And then the last few standards are for genealogical educators and for continuing education. So I urge you to look into this. It's not a process, but it is a way to measure your work to see if you have reached a proven conclusion or a sound conclusion. And this is what we should be aiming for as genealogists to make sure that we've done good quality work. Genealogy standards is a little different from the DAR standards because they recommend using all types of evidence if they have bearing on the question. They don't want you to limit your evidence to what will fit on their form. And it also focuses on general principles that can be applied to all sources. And so it doesn't go into detail like the DAR handbook does, where it talks about find and grave and censuses and stuff. It just talks about different types of analysis. So it encourages careful analyses of source type and information type, and it recommends using the best evidence, whether it's direct, indirect, or negative. And so genealogy standards is a little bit more broad and inclusive. So to wrap this up, how do you know if you've proven an ancestor? Well, if you compare your work against the GPS and you've done all of those parts of the genealogical proof standard. And the DNA standard, the DAR standards are not as high as the GPS. The DAR is focused on brevity, whereas BCG's genealogical proof standard is focused on getting you to the best possible conclusion that's undergone all these different rigorous tests to make sure that you thought of researching all the different sources, that you've analyzed it correctly, you've resolved conflicts, and you've written up your conclusion with citations. So I recommend that to know if you've proven your ancestor. Thank you.